Norman Finkelstein, give us a sketch of the broader context for how this latest flare-up began.
Well, before I do, I'm going to just briefly comment on the ceasefire. The ceasefire, first of all, says nothing about the rampages by Israel against Hamas in the West Bank. And it was those rampages which caused the current conflict to escalate. It gives Israel a green light to continue arresting Hamas members, blowing up homes in the West Bank, ransacking homes, and killing Palestinians, which was the prelude to the current fighting. Secondly, if you look at the ceasefire, it's exactly what was agreed on in June 2008, and the same ceasefire that was agreed to in November 2012. Namely, in both cases, it was said that there would be a relaxing of the illegal blockade of Gaza. In both cases, after the ceasefire was signed, the blockade was maintained, and in fact the blockade was escalated. So now in the current version of the ceasefire, it said the blockade will be lifted after there has been calm restored and the security situation has been established. But if Israel says Hamas is a terrorist organization, then the security situation can never be calm in the Gaza, and therefore there'll be never a lifting of the blockade of Gaza. So we're right back to where we were in June 2008, November 2012. Of course Hamas is going to reject that kind of agreement. It means it legalizes, it legitimizes the brutal, merciless, heartless, illegal blockade of Gaza. As to how we got to where we are, the general context is perfectly obvious for anyone who wants to see it. A unity government was formed between the PA and Hamas. Netanyahu was enraged at this unity government. It called on the U.S., it called on the EU to break relations with the Palestinian Authority. Surprisingly, the United States said no. We're going to give this unity government time. We'll see whether it works or not. Then the EU came in and said, it will also give the unity government time. Let's see what happens. At this point, Netanyahu virtually went berserk, and he was determined to break up the unity government. When there was the abduction of the 3 Israeli teenagers, he found his pretext. There isn't a scratch of evidence, not a jot of evidence that Hamas had anything to do with the kidnappings and the killings. Nobody even knows what the motive was to this point. Even if you look at the July 3rd report of the Human Rights Watch, they said nobody knows who was behind the abductions. Even the U.S. State Department, on July 7th, there was a news conference, and the U.S. State Department said we don't have hard evidence about who was responsible. But that had nothing to do with it. It was just a pretext. The pretext was to go into the West Bank, attack Hamas, arrest 700 members of Hamas, blow up 2 homes, carry on these rampages, these ransackings, and to try to evoke a reaction from Hamas. This is what Israel always does. Anybody who knows the history, it's what the Israeli political scientist, the mainstream political scientist, his name was Avner Yaniv. He said it's these Palestinian peace offensives. Whenever the Palestinians seem like they are trying to reach a settlement of the conflict, which the unity government was, at that point, Israel does everything it can to provoke a violent reaction, in this case from Hamas, break up the unity government, and Israel has its pretext. We can't negotiate with the Palestinian Authority because they only represent some of the Palestinian people. They don't represent all of the Palestinian people. And so Netanyahu does what he always does, what Israeli governments always do. You keep pounding the Palestinians, in this case pounding Hamas, trying to evoke a reaction, and when the reaction comes, when the reaction comes, you say, we can't deal with these people, they're terrorists.
Why do you think Israel has hesitated to launch the invasion? Thousands of soldiers are lined up along the Gaza border.
Well, it's interesting because there are a large number of theories that are being spun, in particular in the Israeli press. But the answer, I think, to that question is pretty obvious. The Israeli domestic population won't tolerate a large number of Israeli combatant casualties. That's out. Israel likes to fight, not unlike President Obama. Israel likes to fight likes to commit high-tech massacres. and it doesn't want to fight a real war. And in 2008, Israel executed the big high-tech massacre in Gaza, killed about 1,400 Palestinians, up to 1,200 of whom were civilians, left behind 600,000 tons of rubble, dropped the white phosphorus, and so forth. And for the first time, the international community reacted very harshly to it. The climax, of course, was the Goldstone report. And at that point, Israel was placed in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, it can't stop the rocket attacks unless it conducts a ground invasion, which is exactly the situation it faced in Lebanon in 2006 also. The Air Force can't knock out these rockets. They're short-range rockets mostly. They're not even rockets, but we'll call them that. The Air Force can't knock them out. The only way to get rid of them, exactly as in Lebanon in 2006, the only way to get rid of them is by launching a ground invasion. However, the domestic population won't accept a large number of casualties. The only way you don't have a large number of casualties is if you blast everything in sight within a mile's radius, which is what Israel did in 2008-9. There were only 10 Israeli military casualties. Of those 10, half of them were friendly fire, Israelis accidentally killing Israelis. But after the Goldstone report and after 2008-9, they can't do that again. They can't carry out that kind of massive destruction, the 22 days of death and destruction, as Amnesty International called it. They can't do that again. A new constraint has been placed on Israel's political and military echelon. So that's the dilemma for them. Domestically, they can't tolerate large numbers of combatant casualties, but the only way to prevent that is blasting everything in sight. The international community says you can't do that. You kill 150, you can kill 200. Human Rights Watch said killing 200 Palestinians in Gaza, that's not a war crime, they said. That's just collective punishment. Only Hamas commits war crimes because one woman apparently died of a heart attack, Israeli woman apparently died of a heart attack while trying to enter a shelter. So that's horrible, awful, that's a war crime. But when you kill 200 Palestinians, 80% of whom are civilians, about 20% of whom are children, according to Human Rights Watch, that's not a war crime. But the international community will accept that much. 200. But even Human Rights Watch won't accept if you go in and you do 2008-9 again. And so the Israeli government is faced with a real dilemma. And that's the problem for Netanyahu. Domestically, he loses if there are large numbers of casualties, combatant casualties. Internationally, he loses if he tries to do 2008-9 all over again.
Which resulted in how many deaths?
2008-9, as I said, it was about 1,400, of whom up to 1,200 were civilians. As I said, 600,000 tons of rubble. They just left nothing there. And by the way, that was demanded by Tzipi Livni. On January 18th, Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister then, the justice minister now, the person who's called a moderate by J Street, Tzipi Livni boasted. She went on TV and boasted, we demanded hooliganism in Gaza. That's what I demanded, she said, and we got it. According to J Street, she's the moderate.
Norman, as we wrap, what needs to be done?
What needs to be done is perfectly obvious. Amnesty International, which is a real human rights organization, unlike Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International issued a statement. It said, number one, there has to be a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel and Palestine. Perfectly reasonable, because under international law, it's illegal to transfer weapons to countries which are major violators of human rights. So, comprehensive arms embargo on Israel and Palestine. Number two, international investigation of war crimes on both sides. And I'm saying number three. Number three there has to be the imposition of sanctions on Israel until and unless it negotiates an end to the occupation according to international law. Now, that's not my suggestion. I'm basing it on the International Court of Justice. South Africa occupied Namibia. The International Court of Justice said in 1971, if South Africa does not engage in good faith negotiations to end its occupation of Namibia, that occupation is illegal under international law. Israel has refused to engage in good faith negotiations to end the occupation of Palestine. Just like in the case of Namibia, it is now an illegal occupier of Palestine, and there should be a comprehensive sanctions imposed on Israel until and unless it ends the occupation of Palestine under the terms of international law.